it got weirder. The court documents were vague, intentionally so. They noted that Kidder used TOR, the browser synonymous with anonymized browsing and the go-to tool for dark web activity. But that was it. The feds knew where he lived, what he'd done, and how he'd done it, yet none of the usual red flags appeared. No mention of seized email accounts, no social engineering, no third-party informants. It was as if someone had flipped on a light in a sealed room and just known he was there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something big. I dug deeper, expecting to hit a dead end. Most dark web busts are tangled in layers of international jurisdiction and buried in red tape. But in Kidder's case, what I found was a black hole of information, almost too clean. The timeline put the bust around 2019, and that rang a bell. The only major dark web operation at the time that was public knowledge was Operation Saboteur, launched by the FBI and Europol, targeting marketplace admins and prolific distributors. But Kidder wasn't that. He wasn't a seller. He wasn't an admin. He didn't run a site. He didn't even talk. He was silent, passive, invisible. So how'd they find him? There were only a few possibilities, and all of them terrifying. The first, he'd stumbled into a honeypot. Law enforcement occasionally takes over dark websites and keeps them running in stealth mode to log traffic. That's how they got users of Playpen in 2015. But if that had happened here, it would likely have been disclosed in some form. Playpen was front-page news and legal precedent. There was no mention of a honeypot in Kidder's case. The second theory was even worse. A network investigative technique, NIT, essentially a remote access malware deployed to de-anonymize users. But if that were true, the complaint would have followed the standard template for NIT usage, like in the Operation Pacifier case. Again, nothing. Not a single line hinted at the use of malware. And then there was the third possibility. He was caught in a traffic correlation attack. That one sent a chill down my spine. To understand why, you need to understand how TOR works. It routes your internet traffic through multiple encrypted nodes across the world, making it nearly impossible to trace a user's real IP. But if a government, say the NSA or GCHQ, controls enough entry and exit nodes, or monitors large-scale traffic in and out of TOR, they can match patterns. It's not foolproof. It's not fast. But it's possible. It's the nuclear option, the kind of surveillance that takes nation-state resources and time. It's overkill unless the person you're targeting is running a child exploitation ring or leaking state secrets. So why would they deploy something that powerful on a guy who downloaded content? Either Brandon Kidder was someone they really wanted, or he was caught as a byproduct of something much, much bigger. I couldn't let it go. My curiosity became obsession. I started mapping other arrests from 2010 to 20 in quiet cases, ones that didn't get press. I combed through court dockets, filtered by cybercrime, and looked for similar phrasing. TOR, redacted complaints, NIT mentions, and most of all, motions to seal documents. That's when I found something that blew the case wide open. Buried in a thread of obscure Reddit comments, someone, username UTZDK4784, posted a link to a list of users believed to be caught in a global operation known as Liberty Lane. I had never heard of it. It wasn't listed on the DOJ site, no public press release. But according to the post, it was an international, multi-year sting targeting over 70 onion sites used for illegal purposes. German authorities had dubbed their branch Boys Town, a bust that made headlines when they took down one of the largest dark web child abuse forums. But that was just one limb of the operation. The Post suggested the UK and US were quietly running traffic analysis across multiple countries, and they'd pulled data from compromised servers, TOR relays, and even VPN providers. Then I saw it, among a list of names linked to that hidden network of takedowns, Brandon Kidder, and suddenly it all made sense. And none of it did. Because if Liberty Lane was real, and if it was as expansive as these threads claimed, then it meant law enforcement had crossed a threshold that most people didn't know existed. They weren't just busting site admins anymore. They were watching the watchers, reading the unspoken movement of digital traffic like it was Morse code. If they could catch someone like Kidder, silent, anonymous, a speck on the radar, then it meant no one was safe. And the most disturbing part? It was still happening. The threads were dated as recently as last year. Liberty Lane wasn't over. It had just gone underground. After discovering Brandon Kidder's name buried in that obscure Reddit thread, I couldn't sleep. I had stumbled onto something massive, something that didn't just explain his arrest, but hinted at a global surveillance program running silently in the shadows. Operation Liberty Lane. It sounded like a code name straight out of a spy thriller. But unlike Hollywood, this was real. The deeper I dug, the more the pieces started to fit, and yet every answer opened 100 new questions. If Liberty Lane was indeed an international sting, why hadn't it been publicly acknowledged? Why were court records sealed or redacted with cryptic references to highly sensitive techniques? And most importantly, how many people were being watched without knowing it? That last question kept me up at night. Because what started as a single Reddit post turned into a full-blown rabbit hole, revealing one of the most secretive surveillance efforts in the digital world. One that didn't just monitor, it predicted. And if the operation was as far-reaching as it seemed, Brandon Kidder wasn't the exception. He was the beginning. From what I gathered, Liberty Lane wasn't one operation. It was a network of operations. Boys Town in Germany, the KAX-17 takedown in Brazil, TOR exit node monitoring in the UK, and unlisted intelligence collection programs in the US, all coordinated under a classified umbrella that allowed allied intelligence agencies to operate in legal gray zones. These weren't the kind of raids that ended in dramatic arrests and press conferences. These were surgical strikes. Quiet, clinical, invisible, and Brandon? He was the prototype for what Liberty Lane could do, a low-profile user, hidden behind layers of encryption, flagged by an algorithm, traced through patterns only a supercomputer could detect. Liberty Lane didn't need Brandon to speak. It didn't need him to transact. It only needed him to exist. That was enough. One particular document I uncovered through PACER filings, though heavily redacted, referenced an international task force working alongside U.S. agencies to identify users of onion sites through something labeled as a multi-node latency beacon framework. I had never heard of that term before. I Googled it. Nothing. Not a single result. That's when it hit me. This wasn't public knowledge. This wasn't even deep state conspiracy theory territory. This was real technology, real people, quietly reshaping the rules of the internet. Liberty Lane had essentially found a way to track people through TOR, not by breaking it, but by subtly altering the environment in which it operated. Think of it like sonar in a submarine. They didn't need to see you. They just needed to feel your ripple. And it gets worse. That Reddit user, Untouchable, who linked Kidder to Liberty Lane, I checked their profile the next day, deleted, completely scrubbed every comment, every post, gone. I tried using archive sites, but the account had been wiped before any bots could back it up, almost like they knew. I started messaging others in the thread. 2 responded. One of them told me their account had been temporarily locked after mentioning Operation Liberty Lane by name in a separate subreddit. The message they received from Reddit: suspicious activity detected, reviewing content for security violations. Let that sink in. Not a TOS violation. Not, say, security violations. What was it about those 3 words that made everything feel so much bigger than some forgotten arrest? I kept pulling at the thread, trying to reconstruct a map of connected arrests. Over time, I noticed a pattern. Most of the individuals tied to these sealed complaints shared 3 things in common: minimal online activity, 2, TOR usage without public exposure, and 3, vague legal language referring to non-standard investigative techniques. These weren't your usual dark web cowboys. They were ghosts, people who'd spent years perfecting their anonymity. And yet, somehow, Liberty Lane found them anyway. One case in Michigan involved a man arrested in early 20. The complaint was sealed, but metadata from court records listed a foreign cyber forensic partner on the case. In another instance, an Illinois man's arrest came with the curious note that the digital evidence was intercepted prior to access point. That phrase haunted me. Prior to access point. What did that even mean? Did it imply that law enforcement saw what the user was doing before it even reached the intended server? If so, we were dealing with surveillance that went beyond the endpoint, beyond the device, beyond the law. Still, no one was talking about it. Liberty Lane didn't show up in government press releases. News outlets hadn't caught on. And most of the legal professionals I reached out to either declined to comment or dismissed it as coincidence. But coincidences don't happen this many times in a row. At this point, I was convinced. Liberty Lane was the digital Manhattan Project, the quiet weaponization of anonymity, the slow surgical unraveling of what we thought was safe. And the scary part? It worked. Because if they could do it to Kidder and dozens of others like him, then what about the rest of us? How many routine arrests were actually test cases for something larger? I started going back through the DOJ site, now with fresh eyes. Phrases that once seemed generic suddenly carried new weight. Information obtained through alternative network methods. Cooperative foreign intelligence source. Anonymous access points monitored through undisclosed techniques. These weren't vague bureaucratic platitudes. They were breadcrumbs, clues hiding in plain sight. And the more I searched, the more I realized we'd all been looking in the wrong direction. Everyone assumes the dark web is the danger, but maybe the real danger is who's watching it. Liberty Lane wasn't just a sting, it was a mirror held up to a world that believed it was invisible. And Brandon Kidder, he was the first reflection to crack. It's worth noting that even Kidder's sentencing didn't make headlines. There were no dramatic quotes from judges, no tearful statements from defense attorneys, just a quiet conviction, a short statement about the use of TOR, and a closed file. But maybe that was the point. Liberty Lane doesn't want attention. It thrives in silence. Every time we forget it exists, it gets stronger. Because the moment we stop asking how these arrests happen, we stop seeing the big picture. And I wasn't ready to stop, not yet. Because if what I'd uncovered was even half true, then Liberty Lane wasn't over. It was just getting started, and the scariest part was still ahead. The more I investigated Operation Liberty Lane, the more it became clear. This wasn't a one-off anomaly. It was a methodical, quietly deployed global mechanism that was years ahead of anything we thought possible. The public always assumed TOR was a digital fortress, and for the most part, it was. But Liberty Lane didn't break TOR. It didn't need to. It simply watched, waited, and listened, like a ghost in the machine. It wasn't just about identifying users like Brandon Kidder. It was about training algorithms, refining latency mapping, understanding human behavior at the edge of anonymity. Every arrest became another calibration point. Every court filing, redacted or sealed, was another invisible node in the system. And as I traced the footprint of the operation, a terrifying idea began to surface. Liberty Lane wasn't an isolated sting. It was a framework, one that could be deployed anywhere, at any time against anyone, not just the worst of the worst, anyone. I stumbled on one case, completely unrelated to dark web content, that sent chills down my spine. A cybersecurity researcher in Massachusetts, never accused of a crime, mentioned in an affidavit as a non-cooperating subject of interest. No charges filed, no arrest. But his internet traffic, encrypted, routed through VPNs and TOR, was flagged by Liberty Lane's predictive metrics. He had been studying cryptographic flaws in hidden services, that's all. And yet, he was named in connection to a network behavior overlap analysis involving suspect nodes. It didn't matter that he wasn't doing anything illegal. It mattered that he looked like someone who might. That's when I realized the most disturbing truth of all. Liberty Lane wasn't just surveillance. It was profiling, behavior-based suspicion, statistical guilt, and the line between prevention and preemption had blurred into nothingness. How did it work? I'll be honest, most of the technical mechanics are still unclear, but based on bits and pieces I have gathered from anonymous cybersecurity forums, leaked research papers, and off-the-record chats with digital forensics experts, here's the best theory. Liberty Lane exploited inconsistencies in TOR relay timings and metadata leakage from badly configured devices or overlapping protocols. Let's say you're browsing on TOR while connected to a Wi-Fi router, also running smart home devices or syncing encrypted backups to the cloud. Liberty Lane would aggregate timing data across multiple endpoints, not just your onion traffic, and analyze the pattern of your internet heartbeat. In other words, it wasn't just looking at what you were doing. It was comparing when and how you were doing it across thousands of signals. That's how they got Kidder. That's how they got the others, not through mistakes, through patterns. The technology was far ahead of public knowledge, and yet the entire operation thrived on silence. No FOIA request returned useful information. No journalist was writing about it. Why? Because the victims weren't loud. They were ghosts. And because Liberty Lane did not need to prove anything in public, it only needed to operate in the blind spots between jurisdictions, where intelligence becomes evidence and surveillance becomes prosecution. The wall between what's legal and what's possible had quietly crumbled. I even found evidence suggesting that Liberty Lane was run in part through private partnerships with cybersecurity contractors, names like Palantir, ZeroFox, and obscure firms with five-letter acronyms kept popping up in technical procurement logs across the UK and US. One document, marked as draft only, not for disclosure, mentioned a multi-sovereign packet obfuscation overlay deployed across cooperative ISP networks. It didn't take a genius to understand what that meant. Liberty Lane didn't just observe TOR traffic. It infected the entire ecosystem. And then came the part I wasn't ready for. While cross-referencing timestamps of known arrests with server uptimes and dark web node failures, I found anomalies. Cases where arrests happened hours after Onion sites suddenly went offline, almost like the site takedown was the cover, not the operation itself. Liberty Lane wasn't just watching users, it was luring them. Sites that had allegedly been taken down by unknown actors would come back online for short bursts, long enough to pull new traffic in, log IP behaviors, and vanish again. These weren't traditional honeypots. They were ghost sites, faint digital echoes designed to extract just enough behavioral metadata before disappearing into the void. It was a digital trap designed for the cautious, not the reckless. That's what made it brilliant and horrifying. The implications hit hard. If Liberty Lane had the capability to track through TOR, if it could simulate dormant sites, if it could flag innocence based on behavioral similarity alone, then the foundation of online privacy wasn't just cracked, it was gone. The myth of anonymity was shattered, and the silence surrounding Brandon Kidder's case suddenly made perfect sense. The government had to bury it. If even one judge questioned the method, the whole house of cards could fall. But they didn't. The court sealed the details. The motion to suppress remained unchallenged, and the message was clear. This is happening, and you're not allowed to ask how. So, where does that leave us? What does it mean for the rest of us who rely on encryption, VPNs, secure messaging apps, and privacy-focused platforms to stay safe, not just from criminals, but from surveillance? It means we're living in a post-privacy era, and most of us don't even know it. Liberty Lane proved that anonymity is a sliding scale, not an absolute. And if your behavior fits the model, even for a moment, you could be swept up in a dragnet that doesn't care about context. It doesn't care about innocence. It cares about indicators. And those indicators are quietly being built into the fabric of every network we touch. Kidder wasn't unique. He was inevitable. I leave you with one final thought. After tracing nearly a dozen cases linked to Liberty Lane, most never covered in the news, most sealed or buried, I found a recurring digital fingerprint embedded in the metadata of certain redacted files, a string of characters likely auto-generated but repeating enough to feel deliberate. It read, LLDR1, Liberty Lane, Delta Region 1. The kind of tag you might use if you were planning to expand into different surveillance regions or layers. Meaning, Liberty Lane wasn't a standalone project. It was a phase, a prototype, a warning. So, next time you open TOR, or send a signal message, or connect to a hidden service, remember this. You may be a ghost, you may be encrypted, but if Liberty Lane is still alive, and I have every reason to believe it is, you're not alone. Someone's listening. Someone's watching. And if they choose to move, you'll never even know it until the knock comes at your door.